How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 20th video on the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the beginning of the 8th chapter of Bruce Fink's book, The Lacanian Subject, titled, There's No Such Thing as a Sexual Relationship. Last time, we looked at Lacan's notion of objet petit a, the cause of desire, and today we're going to be talking about sexuation, one of the most controversial elements of his thought. This chapter is a bit too long to talk about all in one episode, so I'm going to be splitting it up in two. Here, we're going to be looking at all of the first two subchapters and half of the third, these being castration, then the phallus and the phallic function, and there's no such thing as a sexual relationship. From this last section, we'll be looking at the first two subchapters, distinguishing between the sexes, and lastly, but not leastly, the formulas of sexuation. Fink begins the chapter by lamenting the fact that sexuation is one of Lacan's concepts that are most often taken out of context. To amend this, he seeks to do four things. Firstly, he wants to explain what exactly castration is in Lacanian psychoanalysis, something we touched upon briefly last episode. Secondly, he wants to indicate what Lacan is getting at when he states that there is no sexual relationship. Thirdly, he seeks to lay out the formulas of sexuation in some of their complexity, and lastly, but not leastly, he aims to address some of the broader issues implicated by them. Fink starts the first subchapter, castration, by quoting Lacan himself.
What is castration? It isn't like the formulations little Hans puts forwards, that someone unscrews the little faucet. What is at stake is that he cannot take his jouissance inside himself.
Essentially, what castration refers to is the fact that all of us have to, at some point, give up some jouissance. This isn't at all tied to the penis as a biological organ, as perhaps suggested by the name, but rather is experienced by all genders. The obvious question that this notion gives rise to is where exactly the sacrificed jouissance goes. In Fink's words,
is it simply annihilated? Does it simply vanish? Or does it shift to a different level or locus?
The answer is none of the above. It simply transfers over to the big other. The jouissance we sacrifice is left to circulate in the other as language, existing in a sense outside of ourselves. To give a concrete example, just think of surplus value as we talked about last episode. Profit, as the money skimmed off the top from the worker's labor by the capitalist, is experienced by that worker as a loss, just like jouissance in the case of castration. That surplus value, experienced more like a minus by the worker, is then put into circulation inside the other as the free market. This operation isn't only negative, however, it's also constructive. As Fink says,
capitalism creates a loss in its field, which allows an enormous market mechanism to develop.
Likewise, the loss of jouissance that occurs in castration is central to the development of civilization and culture. Freud himself talked of this when discussing what he termed instinctual renunciation. To him, this renunciation is related to the Oedipus complex and its resolution, essentially the giving up of one love object and the seeking of another elsewhere, an operation he viewed as mandatory for the development of cultural achievement. Concerning why Lacan sees castration as important to civilization, Fink says,
the sacrifice of jouissance is necessitated by the other's demand that we speak. That demand is obviously tied to all of culture, for without language, we could have no access to any of them.
Moving on now to an example Lacan gives of castration as a process, Fink gives a quote from Seminar 14, which I think is quite useful in explaining what exactly it is.
No jouissance is given to me or could be given to me other than that of my own body. That is not clear immediately, but is suspected, and people institute around this jouissance, which is good, which is thus my only asset, the protective fence of a so-called universal law called the rights of man. No one can stop me from using my body as I see fit. The result of the limit is that jouissance dries up for everybody.
To unpack what he's saying here, a limitation is created. This limitation, what Lacan speaks of as the rights of man, takes the form of a law that, originally at least, gives me the right to the exclusive jouissance of my own body, prohibiting others from using it as they see fit. However, that very same limitation eventually leads to the destruction of my own jouissance. This idea is central to Lacan's explanation of the relationship between the real and the symbolic that we looked at the beginning of this series. Just as Freud's notions of a superego always oversteps its boundaries, inflicting its cruelest punishments on those who act most ethically, the law oversteps its authority. To quote almost directly from Fink here, the symbolic order kills the living organism in us, overwriting it with signifiers, to the point that being dies and only the signifier lives on. Hence the famous phrase, "the letter kills." Limit, lack, and loss. These three things are what are front and center when it comes to Lacanian logic, and these are what make up castration. This takes us now to the next section of the chapter, titled The Phallus and the Phallic Function. Fink begins this section by relating that, in the quest for love and attention, children eventually come to the realization that they aren't the sole object of their parents' desire. There are a multitude of other objects that divert them away. This is a pretty big deal for that child, since, as stated by Fink,
the parent's attention is what has the highest value in the child's universe. It is the gold standard, so to speak, that value against which all other values are measured.
Eventually, one signifier comes to signify all elements of the parent's desire that go beyond the child. The signifier, occasionally termed the signifier of desire, is what Lacan means when he discusses the phallus. Much like in the case of castration, this phallus isn't at all connected to the penis as a biological organ, a distinction underlined again and again by Lacan throughout his career. Something else important to do is to also distinguish between objet petit a as the cause of desire and the phallus as its signifier. Desire's cause is unsignifiable. It exists in the real, as pure desirousness. The phallus, on the other hand, is the so-called name of desire. It simply represents it, instead of producing it. Additionally, because desire is always tied to something missing, the phallus is also the signifier of lack. In Lacan's words,
The phallus is the signifier of the very loss the subject undergoes, due to the breaking into pieces brought on by the signifier.
this puts it in conjunction with castration, a primordial loss which sets the structure, the symbolic, in motion. The phallus is the representation of that loss. Lacan also ties it together with the loss or want of being, something we went over in an earlier video in the series, the fifth, I believe. If you don't remember, the subject's place in symbolic is originally like an empty set in mathematics, one devoid of any elements. This set, although it doesn't contain anything, turns nothing into something simply by marking or representing it. The phallus is what names the set, wrestling it into an existence and creating a place for the subject to come into being. In this way, lack is essential for the functioning of a symbolic. Without the phallus, what reason would an individual have to enter into language? Fink demonstrates this with the hypothetical of a child whose caregivers are able to figure out and preemptively fulfill all its needs without communication. There's no reason for this child to alienate itself by entering language, since there are no lacks for it to communicate. In his words,
If nourishment is never missing, if the desired warmth is never lacking, why would the child take the trouble to speak?
he ends off the subchapter by quickly going over what exactly the phallic function is. Essentially, it is the function that institutes lack, or, in other words, it is the alienating function of language, that which gets alienation started. This brings us now to the last section we'll be looking at today. There's no such thing as a sexual relationship. On first glance, this statement, one of Lacan's most controversial and misinterpreted, may seem a bit odd. Of course sexual relationships exist. People obviously have sex. However, what he's actually getting at is the fact that there's no relationship between the sexes. Phrased perhaps more accurately, Lacan claims that there's no direct connection between men and women, as men and women. Something always stands in the way. In this section, from which we'll cover the first couple subchapters today, Fink seeks to show what Lacan does two things with sexuation. Firstly, he demonstrates that the sexes are defined separately and differently, and secondly, he shows that their quote-unquote partners are neither symmetrical or overlapping. The reason for why he does this, psychoanalytically, has to do with the problems inherent in biological explanations of sexual difference. Lacan's analysans show him that, In Fink's words,
their biomedically determined sex, genitalia, chromosomes, etc., can be at odds with both socially defined notions of masculinity and femininity and their own choice of sexual partners.
At first, Fink warns, Lacan's attempt may seem unnecessarily dense and packed with unneeded Freudian baggage. However, he says, it's important to keep in mind that Lacan was inventing as he developed his new way of thinking about sexual difference, not always knowing where exactly he was going. Fink's goal here is to outline his theory, beginning with his discussion of mathemes, one of the more opaque parts of Lacanian psychoanalysis. This takes us to the first sub-chapter, distinguishing between the sexes. He starts off with a quote from Freud that ought to set the theme for the rest of the chapter.
Pure masculinity and pure femininity remain theoretical constructs of uncertain content.
Returning to the text itself, Fink says that sexuation applies only to neurotic individuals. Lacan viewed masculinity and femininity as being defined in relation to the symbolic order, and as such, psychotics, who are characterized by the refusal to enter into the symbolic, don't experience the same processes. Moving on now, he begins with the definition of men. Essentially, those who are designated as such in psychoanalysis, regardless of their biological sex or their gender, can be described as wholly determined by the phallic function that we discussed earlier. In Fink's words,
despite the infinite permutations allowed by the language in the constitution of desire, man can be seen as bounded or finite with respect to the symbolic register.
What he means by this is that there is some kind of limit or boundary that men, those who have a masculine structure, just cannot cross. This boundary is the father and his incest taboo. As Fink says, man's desire never goes beyond the incestuous wish, which is impossible to realize because to do so would uproot the so-called nom du père, or name or know, of the father. Man's pleasure, governed by this no, is severely reined in, its boundary points being marked out by the phallic function. Limited to the interplay of signifiers, Lacan terms the pleasure experienced by men as phallic jouissance, a form of enjoyment that always inevitably disappoints, always falls just a little too short. When it comes to fantasy, men are tied to the aspect of the real that underlines the symbolic order, objet pétia, or the cause of desire. This object is only peripherally attached to other people, which is why Lacan explains phallic jouissance as being inherently masturbatory. Moving on now, he says that, unlike with men, women, or rather those who have a feminine structure, completely independent of sex or gender, are defined by not being fully under the sway of the phallic function. What this means is that, in Fink's words,
whereas men's pleasure is altogether determined by the signifier, woman's is partially determined by the signifier, but not wholly.
Along with phallic jouissance, women are also able to experience something else. This something else being the other's jouissance. He doesn't really get into what this means at this point in the book, but it's something important to keep in mind as we keep going. With a quick summary of the two positions out of the way, Fink gets into explaining the relationship between biology and sexual difference, or the lack thereof. Essentially, when Lacan talks about sexuation, it has nothing to do with actual sex or gender. There can be male hysterics, those who experience both forms of jouissance yet aren't women, and female obsessive compulsives, those who experience only phallic jouissance but who also aren't men. All genders can have either structure, and therefore it's quite important for analysts to get outside the habit of assuming based on biological sex. This takes us to the next sub-chapter of the section, the last one we'll be looking at today. It's titled The Formulas of Sexuation, and deals with just that. To start off with, Fink offers this diagram, Lacan's infamous graph of sexuation. Before we get into it, it might be worth to quickly familiarize ourselves with the symbols used in predicate logic. Essentially, this backwards E is what is termed an existential quantifier. It is read as there exists at least one X. This is in contrast to the upside down A, which represents a universal quantifier, read as for all, or the whole of X. When it comes to the phi, this isn't based in logic at all, and instead simply represents the phallic function. The line that we can see on top of these quantifiers essentially acts to negate the symbol beneath it. With that out of the way, we can now read the masculine side of the top box, as the whole of man falls under the phallic function. However, there exists one who doesn't. This is demonstrated by Fink with yet another diagram, showing man in relation to the father. This father is what defines man as wholly subject to the phallic function, since it acts to basically delimit the set. To paraphrase an old French maxim,
every universal claim is grounded in the existence of an exception which proves the rule.
In this case, it is the father who acts as the exception. However, it's important to note that this isn't just any old dad. No. Instead, Lacan associates this figure with the mythical father of the horde, presented in Freud's 1913 book Totem and Taboo. This primal father is that which is not subject to castration or the phallic function, not restrained by any limits. In Fink's words,
he, the primal father, is not subject to the law. He is his own law.
To perhaps gloss over this section a bit, the main takeaway is that this primal father no longer exists. It's dead. All men or masculinely structured individuals are wholly castrated, placed under the phallic function. However, the idea of a primal father, as that which is unrestrained and not limited by the law, lives on in each of their fantasies. With this, Fink moves on to feminine structure. Returning to the table of sexuation, we can see that the top right corner can be read as women do not fall under the phallic function entirely, but there are also no women who escape it fully. The reason for this second qualifier is that, without castration, one becomes psychotic, foreclosing the phallic function, in other words, treating it as if it had never existed in the symbolic at all. It is the step that stops alienation from entering the child into language. Continuing, Fink says that one way of visualizing these elements of feminine structure is a tangent curve, where at pi/2, the curve goes off the map and then reappears mysteriously on the other side. There is no real value that can be associated with the curve, forcing us to use expressions like,
the value of y approaches positive infinity as x goes to pi/2 from 0, and approaches negative infinity as x goes from pi to pi/2.
No one really knows where exactly the two lines meet up, yet we are still able to talk about it through the adoption of a system of symbols. In much the same way, the other's jouissance, which we touched upon earlier in this episode, goes off a scale, escaping the map of representation. Ending the sub-chapter, Fink says that this is why Lacan states women don't fall fully under the phallic function. The other's jouissance acts essentially as a logical exception, a case which throws into question the whole, to borrow his words. Masculine structure is defined as universalizable due to the fact that every member is castrated, whereas feminine structure is a bit more complex. To get a bit ahead of ourselves, it's for this reason that Lacan famously stated woman does not exist, referring to how it's impossible to boil a woman down into a single archetype. Now, this concludes the first half of the chapter There is no such thing as a sexual relationship from Bruce Fink's book The Lacanian Subject. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we'll be finishing off the chapter. Until then, bye!